The morning Clara Whitfield rode into Dusty Creek, Montana, with nothing but a carpetbag, a broken wagon wheel, and a letter from a dead man. Not a single soul in that town could have predicted she would never leave. It was October of 1882, and the wind had already begun its autumn threats, sweeping down from the Rockies with a cold that bit through wool coats and settled into the bones of anyone foolish enough to be standing in the open. Clara was standing in the open. She had been standing in the open, metaphorically speaking, for the better part of 2 years, ever since her husband Gerald had died of a fever outside of Cheyenne and left her with his debts, his broken promises, and a name that meant nothing to anyone west of the Missouri River. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair that had come loose from its pins somewhere along the last 20 miles of trail, and green eyes that had the particular quality of looking both exhausted and stubbornly alive at the same time. She was not a fragile woman, though she had been through enough to break a fragile one entirely. She had grown up on a farm in Pennsylvania, had learned to work hard before she learned to read, and had married Gerald Whitfield at 19 because he had a silver tongue and a plan that sounded reasonable until it wasn't. Now she was here, in a town she had never heard of, trying to find a man named Thomas Hale who owed Gerald money that Clara needed to survive the coming months. The wagon wheel had cracked 3 miles outside of town, and the horse, a temperamental gray mare named Bess, had pulled her the rest of the way at a pace that suggested Bess had opinions about being a pack horse. The general store was the first building Clara saw that looked like it might have someone helpful inside, so she tied Bess to the post outside and pushed through the door. The man behind the counter was round and red-cheeked and wore spectacles that magnified his eyes to an almost comical degree. He introduced himself as Harold Finch, proprietor, and he regarded Clara with the particular mix of sympathy and wariness that small-town men reserved for women who arrived alone. "I am looking for Thomas Hale," Clara said, setting her carpetbag on the floor and straightening her coat. "I was told he runs a ranch somewhere outside of town." Harold Finch's magnified eyes got even wider. "Tom Hale." Sure. He runs the Circle H about 4 miles north. Big spread. Good man." He paused, studying her face. "You family of his?" "No, business." She did not elaborate, and Harold Finch, to his credit, did not push. He gave her directions, told her she might want to get that wagon wheel looked at by Silas the blacksmith before she tried those 4 miles, and sold her a small piece of cornbread for 3 cents because she looked, in his words, like she had not eaten since Tuesday. It was Friday. She thanked him, ate the cornbread standing at the counter, and asked about the blacksmith. Harold pointed her 2 doors down, so Clara picked up her bag and went 2 doors down. The blacksmith's workshop was open on the street side, and the sound coming out of it was the rhythmic, decisive clang of a hammer on iron. Clara stepped into the doorway and stopped. The man working at the anvil was not what she had expected. She had expected someone old and barrel-shaped, the kind of blacksmith who appears in every town like a fixed geographical feature. This man was perhaps 28 or 29. Tall and lean in the way that hard work makes a man rather than in the way that deprivation does. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the ends where it met the collar of his shirt, and his forearms, exposed to the elbow where his sleeves were rolled back, were corded with muscle from years at exactly this labor. He was concentrating entirely on the piece of iron he was shaping, and for a moment he did not hear her. Then Bess, tied outside, made a sound of displeasure about something, and the man looked up. His eyes were brown, deep brown, with something in them that Clara would later struggle to name precisely. Not sadness, exactly, though it lived near sadness. Not loneliness either, though it lived near that too. It was more like the look of a man who had learned to be very still inside himself, and who found that stillness most of the time perfectly adequate, and who was at this moment slightly surprised to find it disturbed. "I have a broken wheel," Clara said, because it was true, and because it seemed like the most efficient thing to say. "I can see you have a broken wheel," the man said, nodding toward the mare outside where the detached wheel leaned crookedly against the wagon body. His voice was low and measured, a voice that did not waste syllables. "Silas is out back. I can get him." "Are you not Silas?" "No, I am Eli Calloway. I work the ranch up the road." He set down the hammer and reached for a cloth to wipe his hands. "Silas lets me use the forge when I need to. He will be back in about an hour. You are welcome to wait." Clara looked back at the gray sky and felt the wind push against the back of her neck. "I will wait," she said. That was how it began, not with anything romantic or dramatic or even particularly interesting. It began with a broken wheel and an hour to wait and two people who had nothing better to do than be in the same space. Eli brought her a stool and went back to his work. Clara sat and watched him, partly because there was nothing else to look at and partly because there was something restful about watching a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He was making a set of hinges, he told her when she asked, for the barn door at his ranch. He had a ranch then. She had assumed from his manner of working the forge that he was a hand, but he said it so plainly, "My ranch," that she revised her assessment. They talked in the way that people talk when they are not trying to make an impression on each other, in short exchanges with comfortable silences between them. She told him she was looking for Thomas Hale. He said Tom was a decent man, that he had known him for 6 years, that Tom's spread was doing well, and he was someone who could be relied upon to honor a debt if he owed one. He said it matter-of-factly, without asking what the debt was, and she appreciated that more than she could have said. He asked where she had come from. She said Cheyenne most recently, but before that Pennsylvania. He said he had heard Pennsylvania was green. She said it was very green, greener than she had realized until she had spent 2 years looking at the high plains. He said he had grown up in Texas, outside of San Antonio, and that he sometimes forgot what trees looked like until he went up into the mountains. He said it without self-pity, just as a fact about the landscape. Silas came back 40 minutes later, a compact man of about 50 with a white beard and an evaluating squint. He looked at the wheel, quoted her a price that was fair, and said he could have it done by tomorrow morning. Clara did not have enough money to stay at the hotel for a night and also buy supplies for the journey to wherever she was going after she spoke to Thomas Hale. She did the arithmetic in her head quickly and felt something that was not quite panic but was in the neighborhood. "Is there somewhere I could sleep that would not cost much?" she asked Silas. He scratched his beard. "Alice Tremblay takes boarders. $1 a night, meals included. North end of town, yellow house." $1 was manageable. Clara thanked him and picked up her bag. "I can walk you up," Eli said from behind her. She turned. He had put his coat back on and was holding his hat, which he had removed at some point without her noticing. He held it the way men held hats when they were trying to be polite, loosely, almost apologetically. "I am going that direction anyway," he added. She studied him for a moment. He met her gaze steadily without any pushiness in it. She decided he was telling the truth about going that direction. "All right," she said. They walked north through Dusty Creek together, and he pointed out things as they passed. The new schoolhouse that had just been completed, the doctor's office where old Dr. Marsh had practiced for 20 years before his son came out from Ohio to take over, the church that held services on Sundays for anyone who wanted to attend and never made anyone feel they had to. He spoke about the town the way a man speaks about a place he has chosen rather than a place he has simply ended up, with a kind of quiet investment. At the yellow house, Alice Tremblay met them at the door and proved to be a brisk, kind woman of about 50 who took Clara's $1 and showed her to a room that was small but spotlessly clean, with a quilt on the bed and a view of the mountains through the window. Clara stood at that window for a long moment after Alice left, looking at those mountains, which were already white at the tops with the season's first snow. She heard Eli's voice downstairs, speaking to Alice, and then the sound of the front door closing, and then silence. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself be tired for a few minutes, which was something she rarely permitted. Then she washed her face in the basin, repinned her hair, and went down to supper. Thomas Hale came to town the next morning. He was a big, genial man of about 50, with a handshake that could have tightened a wheel bolt and an honest face that made Clara understand immediately why Harold Finch had called him a good man. He had, in fact, been looking for her, he said. He had written to Gerald's last known address 3 times and received no answer. He had the money he owed ready in an envelope, as if he had been keeping it somewhere accessible on the chance she might appear. It was not a fortune. $340, which represented Gerald's investment in a cattle deal that Hale had come out ahead on. But $340 was enough to establish something if she was careful, enough to rent a room for several months, or to buy a small parcel of land if she found the right situation, or to keep herself in supplies through a winter. Thomas Hale, while counting the bills into the envelope, asked her what her plans were. She told him honestly that she was still working that out. He nodded, the way men nod when they respect a straight answer, and said that if she needed work, he could use a cook and housekeeper at the Circle H through the winter since his wife had gone to Denver to care for her mother, and the bunkhouse cook had quit. She thanked him and said she would consider it. She went to collect Bess and the repaired wagon from Sela's. When she led the mare out of Sela's yard and onto the main street, she nearly walked directly into Eli Calloway, who was coming out of the feed store with a 50-pound sack over one shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He stopped and shifted the sack and looked at her with that steady, unhurried look. "Heading out?" "Not yet," she said. "I have some thinking to do first." He nodded slowly. "There is a bench in front of the general store. Good thinking spot in my experience." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, the way a sound will sometimes escape before you have decided to let it out. She had not laughed since before Gerald died, and possibly not much before that either. Eli looked at her laugh with an expression that was surprised and quietly pleased, the way a man looks when he witnesses something unexpectedly good. She sat on the bench. He loaded his feed sack into the back of his buckboard, tied it down, and came and sat on the other end of the bench without asking if she wanted company. She found she did not mind. "Do you know the Hale Ranch?" she asked. "I do. Good operation. He offered me work, cooking and housekeeping through the winter." "That is honest work," Eli said. "I am not opposed to honest work." She looked down the street at the mountains, visible at the end of the main road, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. "I just do not know if I want to spend a winter working for someone else's household when I have enough money to perhaps start thinking about my own situation." Eli was quiet for a moment. "What kind of situation are you thinking about?" "I do not know yet. I came out west with Gerald because he had an idea that kept changing. I never had much chance to think about what I would want if it were up to me." He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, looking at the street rather than at her. "That is a hard thing to start over like that, but $300 is a reasonable start out here. Land is still attainable if you know where to look. There are women homesteading on their own. It is not easy, but it is not impossible." "Have you been out here long?" 7 years. "Came up from Texas in 1875 when I was 21. Worked as a hand for 4 years, saved every cent, bought 40 acres from a man who was leaving, built it up since then." She looked at him. 21 in 1875 meant he was 28 now. She had been right in her initial estimate. "Built it up to what?" she asked. He seemed to think about whether to answer for exactly 1 second. 260 acres, 120 head of cattle, a house I built myself, a good well." She considered this. There was no boast in how he said it, it was a report of facts. "You did that in 7 years, she said. It was not entirely a question. "I worked most of the daylight hours most of those years," he said simply. "And I had some luck with the cattle prices 2 years running, and I did not spend money on things I did not need." Clara looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about Gerald, who had always been spending money on things he did not need, who had always been one scheme away from the stability he kept promising. She thought about how tired she was of instability. "I think I will take Thomas Hale's offer," she said, "for the winter. It gives me time to understand the land out here before I make decisions." Eli straightened up. That is a sensible plan. She turned to look at him directly. You are a very practical man, aren't you? Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile but was in the same family. I have been told that. Is it a complaint when people tell you that? Now it was a smile, small and real, the kind that takes effort to produce because it has not been practiced much. Mostly yes, he said. She smiled back. I do not mean it as a complaint. He looked at her for just a moment longer than necessary before standing and picking up his hat from the bench beside him. I ranch about 2 miles from the Circle H, he said. If you need anything or if there is trouble, ask anyone in town which way the Calloway spread is. They will tell you. She thanked him. He put his hat on and walked to his buckboard and drove north out of town, and she watched the buckboard until it turned a corner and disappeared, and she felt something she did not immediately examine because she was practical about her own emotions the same way she was practical about everything else. She went to find Thomas Hale and accept his offer. The winter that year arrived in earnest in November, which anyone who had been in Montana for even one season could have told Clara to expect, but which still, when it came, took her breath away with its severity. The snow came down thick and constant for 4 days straight starting on the 11th of November, and when it stopped, the world outside the Circle H was white from ground to sky, silent and absolute, and so beautiful it almost seemed unfair. Clara had settled into the rhythm of the Hale Ranch with the efficiency she applied to everything. She cooked for Thomas and his 3 ranch hands, a serious young man named Pete who was 19 and growing into himself, a Mexican cowboy named Rodrigo who had worked for Hale for 8 years and who played the guitar on winter evenings when the work was done, and an older hand named Sam Duckett who told long stories about the old cattle drives down in Texas that Clara suspected were 40% embellishment, but were entertaining regardless. She kept the house clean and orderly, mended what needed mending, kept the larder stocked from what Hale had laid in for the season, and found that she had more time in the evenings than she had anticipated. She used it to read the small collection of books that Thomas Hale kept on a shelf in the sitting room, a worn Bible, a copy of Dickens, 2 books about cattle management, and a remarkable dime novel about frontier adventure that was clearly not meant for serious literature, but was impossible to put down. Eli Calloway came by the Circle H for the first time on a Thursday in late November, about 2 weeks into the heavy weather, with a haunch of venison across the back of his horse, and a reason to speak to Hale about shared fence line. Clara heard his voice from the kitchen before she saw him, that particular low cadence that she had remembered more clearly than she had admitted to herself. She brought coffee out to the sitting room where he and Hale were talking, and Eli stood up when she came in, which Thomas Hale did not, because Thomas Hale had grown comfortable enough with her presence to stop standing up, which was its own kind of respect. Eli stood with his hat in his hand and thanked her for the coffee with a seriousness that suggested he meant it. How are you finding the winter? He asked her while Hale stepped out to check something with Pete. It is extraordinary, she said, honestly. I have never seen weather like it. In Pennsylvania the winters were cold, but this is something different entirely. Does it trouble you? She thought about the question which he had asked as if the answer genuinely mattered to him. No, she said after a moment. It is the kind of thing that is hard but not bad. Do you understand what I mean by that distinction? He looked at her with that steady quality she had come to recognize. I think I do, he said. Hard but not bad, like early mornings in the cold or the last mile of a long ride. Exactly like that, she said. He came back the following Thursday, and the one after that, always with a reason that was plausible, but that Thomas Hale had begun watching with the mild, affectionate attention of a man who found the situation gently amusing. He brought fence wire the second week and stayed for supper because the weather turned while he was there, and it would have been foolish to ride 2 miles in a whiteout. He stayed for a game of cards afterward and lost to Rodrigo 3 times, which he accepted without complaint, and won once against Sam Duckett, which he accepted with equal equanimity. He and Clara talked. They talked the way they had talked on the bench outside the general store, easily, without performing at each other, and she found that she looked forward to Thursdays with an honesty she had stopped trying to disguise from herself by December. She found out, in pieces, over those Thursday evenings, more of who he was. His father had worked cattle in Texas and had been a fair man but a distant one, more comfortable with horses than with people. His mother had died when he was 12, of a fever, and the loss had left him with a self-sufficiency that had become structural over time. He had a younger sister, Nora, who had married a farmer in Kansas 4 years ago, and with whom he corresponded faithfully every month. He was not a church-going man, but he was a moral one, and there was a difference between those things that she appreciated. He had come to Montana for the land, he said. The land in Texas was hard and competitive, and every acre was fought over. Montana was different. The land up here was harder in the weather but more open in the opportunity, and he had looked at those mountains the first time he had ridden up from the south and felt something resolve inside him that had been unresolved since his mother died. He had stayed because this place felt, in some way he could not fully articulate, like the right size. She told him things too. She told him about Pennsylvania, about her father who had been a quiet, gentle farmer and her mother who had been fiercely competent and not always kind but absolutely reliable, and how she had confused those two qualities with love for a long time. She told him about marrying Gerald, not in a way that blamed herself or excused him entirely, but in a way that was simply accurate about what had happened and how she had navigated it, and what she had come away from it understanding about herself. He listened to all of it with an attention that was rare, not nodding along automatically but actually listening, asking questions that showed he had understood what she had said and was thinking about it seriously. One evening in mid-December, they were sitting on the porch of the Circle H after supper, despite the cold, because the sky had cleared and the stars over Montana in winter are a spectacle that requires witnessing. Rodrigo was inside playing guitar softly, and the sound drifted out to them through the walls. "Do you ever think about what you want the next 10 years to look like?" she asked. Eli was quiet for a long moment, looking at the stars. "I think about it more lately than I did," he said, and the way he said it made her look at him, and when she looked at him he was looking back at her. She held his gaze and felt something in her chest that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable but was very present, the way a fire feels when you stand close to it. "What do you think about?" she asked. He looked back at the stars. "The ranch is doing well enough that I could think about expanding. There is 40 acres adjacent to my north fence that the owner would sell. I have been considering it." He paused. "I think about what the house would look like if it were used by more than one person. It is a good size for more than one person. I built it that way, though I am not sure I knew why at the time." Clara looked at the mountains, which were black shapes against a glittering sky. "That is a large thing to say," she said quietly. "I know it," he said equally quietly. They did not say anything else for a while, but the silence between them had changed, and they both felt it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. He rode home that night in the cold, and she went inside to her room and stood at the window watching his lantern light move through the dark until it disappeared. And she thought about what he had said about the house being the right size for more than one person, and she thought about what she had said about hard but not bad, and she thought that she might be falling in love with Eli Calloway. She thought about it practically, the way she thought about everything. He was a man of character, real and demonstrated character, not the kind Gerald had talked about but the kind that showed up in how he treated every person he interacted with. He was honest, hardworking, grounded in this land and this life in a way that felt permanent and real. He was 28 and she was 24, and neither of them was a child. He was not a man who said things he did not mean. She decided that she was, in fact, falling in love with him, and that this was not a problem but a development, and that she would allow it to continue at whatever pace it chose to continue. Christmas came to Dusty Creek with a kind of earnest festivity that Clara found unexpectedly moving. Alice Tremblay organized a gathering at the church hall on Christmas Eve, and nearly everyone in the county came in from their ranches and homesteads, men and women and children bundled in every coat they owned, and the hall was warm and loud and smelled of pine and cinnamon. The women had cooked for days, and the tables were full of things that would have been impossible to believe if you had only seen the bare-bones functionality of ranch cooking on a regular day. Eli was there. He arrived with a jar of honey from his own bees, which he gave to Alice Tremblay, and a bottle of something amber that he shared with Thomas Hale and Sam Duckett with minimal ceremony. He found Clara near the window where she was talking with the doctor's wife, and he stood beside her for much of the evening, not possessively, just present, and several people noted it in the way that small-town people note these things. At some point near midnight, when the gathering was winding down and people were beginning to collect their coats, Eli brought her a cup of cider and stood beside her and said, very quietly so that only she could hear, "You should know that I have not stopped thinking about what I said on the porch." She took the cup. "Nor have I," she said, equally quietly. He looked at her with something open and serious in his expression. "I'm not a man who says things lightly, Clara." "I know," she said. "I have noticed that about you." "I would like to court you," he said, "properly, if you are willing." She looked at him for a long moment in the warm lamplight of the Christmas hall, with the sounds of people saying their good nights around them and the smell of pine and cinnamon in the air, and she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. "I am willing," she said. He nodded once, and something in his face shifted the way a landscape shifts when the sun comes out from behind a cloud. The same landscape, but entirely different in quality. January in Montana was a test of character, and Eli Calloway passed it spectacularly. He came to the Circle H twice a week now, not just Thursdays, and sometimes he came just to sit with her for an hour and drink coffee and talk, and sometimes he came with things that needed doing, a fence repair or a supply run, and he would do the practical thing and then stay and talk. He helped Pete with a young horse that had been giving trouble, spending most of a Saturday afternoon with a patience that impressed even Thomas Hale. He showed Clara which berries grew near the creek in summer and would be good for preserves, walking her out on a clear day to show her where the bushes were even though they were buried under 2 feet of snow, and she had to take his word for it that there were berries under there somewhere. He kissed her for the first time in January, on a still afternoon when the temperature had dropped low enough to make the air sparkle. They were walking back from the creek, and she had slipped on a patch of ice and he had caught her, both hands gripping her upper arms, and the catch had brought her close to him, and for a moment neither of them moved. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. Her heart was doing something that had nothing to do with the near fall. He looked at her face for one long moment of what felt like asking a question, and then he kissed her. It was careful and brief and entirely unhurried, the kiss of a man who was not trying to take something but to offer something, and when he lifted his head, there was a warmth in his eyes that she thought might be the most beautiful thing she had seen since those Montana stars on the clear December night. "All right?" he asked, and the question was genuine. "More than all right," she said. He smiled then, a real smile, not the small careful one she had been getting until now, and she understood that this was what his face was like when he let it be. She stored it somewhere. February arrived with a ferocity that made November and December seem temperate. The snow came sideways for 3 days, and the temperature at night dropped to places that made survival a serious undertaking. The ranch hands worked in shifts to keep the cattle from drifting into the fences and to keep the water in the troughs from freezing solid. Clara cooked constantly, because men working in cold like that burned through food the way a fire burns through kindling, and the kitchen was the warmest room in the house, and sometimes Pete or Rodrigo would come in just to stand near the stove for 5 minutes before going back out. Eli rode over on the second day of the worst weather despite the conditions, and Thomas Hale let him in with the look of a man who was not even slightly surprised. Eli sat in the kitchen and drank coffee while Clara cooked, and he told her without particular drama that his well pump had partially frozen, and he had spent the morning with his hands in near-freezing water fixing it, and she looked at his hands and made him hold them near the stove until the color came back. "You should not have ridden over in weather like this," she said, not scolding but genuine. "I wanted to see that you were all right," he said. "I am inside a warm house," she pointed out. "I know, I still wanted to see it for myself." She looked at him, this man who rode 2 miles through brutal cold because he wanted to see for himself that she was all right, and she thought that whatever she had felt growing over these months had grown into something she no longer needed to be careful about naming. "I am completely all right," she said, softer now. "Are you?" "Now I am," he said simply. It was in February, during one of those kitchen evenings, that Clara understood something about her own future with a clarity that surprised her. She had been thinking of herself as someone in a temporary situation, a woman between one life and the next, staying at the Circle H until the winter passed and she could figure out her next step. But somewhere in the past months that framing had become inaccurate. She was not waiting for her life to begin. Her life was here, in this kitchen, in this valley, in these mountains, in the company of this quiet, steady man who rode through blizzards to see that she was safe. She did not panic at this realization. She examined it carefully, the way she examined everything, and found it solid. The cold finally broke in the last week of February, not spring, not even close to spring, but the particular relenting that Montana offered as a sign that the worst was over. The temperature climbed to something merely difficult rather than potentially fatal, and the sky cleared to a blue so intense it seemed to have been polished. Everyone who had been inside for weeks came out and stood in the thin sun and looked at the white landscape and felt something that was not quite happiness but was adjacent to it, the relief of survival. Eli took Clara riding that Sunday afternoon, the first day that the trails were passable, on 2 horses from the Circle H stable with Hale's easy permission. They rode north through the snow-covered valley with the mountains rising on either side, and he showed her the land the way he had shown her the berry bushes, with the proprietary love of someone who had chosen a place and then spent years learning it. He showed her his ranch. He had not specifically invited her before, and she had not asked, but now he turned north at a fork in the trail and said, "This way," and she followed him. The Calloway place was set against a rise that blocked the north wind, 2 stories of timber and stone with a covered porch along the front, and a barn that was larger and more solidly built than the house itself. The house looked, from the outside, like something that had been constructed with care and the intention of permanence. The barn had a weather vane on it in the shape of a running horse. He showed her the inside. It was spare and clean, the inside of a man who kept things in order because disorder irritated him, with good functional furniture and a stone fireplace in the main room, and a kitchen with a wood stove that was newer than anything at the Circle H. There were 2 rooms upstairs, and a study off the main room that had his desk and the ranch's account books. The books were meticulous. She could see from across the room. "What do you think?" he asked her, and the question had layers in it that she understood. She stood in the main room and looked at the fireplace and the winter light coming through the windows and felt something that she recognized as wanting, specific, and real. "I think," she said, "that it is a very good house." He was standing about 5 feet from her, and he closed the distance slowly, and when he was close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, he said, "I have been thinking about what I said in the fall. About the house being the right size for more than one person. I remember," she said. "I have been thinking about asking you something," he said, "and I keep wanting to wait until I am sure you are ready, and then I realize I am not sure how to measure that." "Ask," she said simply. He took a breath. "Clara, I would like you to marry me, not because it is practical, though it is practical, because I love you. Because you are the most real and honest person I have met in my life, and because this house is empty in a way that it was not before I knew you, and because I want every Thursday for the rest of my life, and then every other day as well." She looked at him for a long moment in the winter light. Her throat was tight in a way that was entirely welcome. She thought about Gerald and all the things she had settled for and all the things she had told herself were good enough. She thought about how she had known for months that this was different, that this was the thing Gerald had talked about but never actually been. "Yes," she said. "Eli, yes." He exhaled like a man who has been holding his breath longer than he knew, and then he put his hands on her face, carefully, as if she was something to be handled with respect, and he kissed her in the winter light of his main room, the house he had built with his own hands, and she kissed him back with everything she had been keeping careful for years. They were married in March, when the snow had softened to something navigable, and the first hints of mud and green were appearing at the edges of things. Alice Tremblay took charge of the flowers, which were dried from the previous summer, but arranged with an artistry that made them look like they were fresh. Harold Finch contributed 2 bottles of good wine from somewhere in the back of his storage that he had been saving for the right occasion. Rodrigo played guitar during the ceremony, which was held in the church with the minister presiding, the same church that held services for anyone who wanted to attend and never made anyone feel they had to. Thomas Hale walked Clara up the aisle because there was no one else to do it, and because he had come to feel a fatherly affection for her that he expressed in his big handshake manner, and he gripped her hand before he delivered her to Eli and said, very low, "Gerald would be glad. I think this one is the right kind." She squeezed his hand back. Eli stood at the front of that church in a good jacket that she later found out he had ridden to the next town to buy, because his existing jacket did not feel right for the occasion, and he looked at her coming up the aisle with an expression so unguarded and plain in its love that half the women in the church reached for their handkerchiefs. The minister read them their vows and they repeated them back, and when Eli said, "I will," the word came out quiet and absolute, the way all his words came out, and she believed it entirely. They moved into the Calloway ranch that afternoon, because spring work would not wait for anyone and there was no time for a proper journey, but they did not mind. The house that had been spare became full, not cluttered, but inhabited, the way a house is supposed to be. Her carpetbag, which had been sitting in the corner of the room at the Circle H since October, finally unpacked properly, her things among his things on the shelves and in the drawers. Spring came to Montana the way it always does there, reluctantly and then all at once. The snow retreated up the mountains, and the valley greened with a speed that seemed almost aggressive after so much white, as if the land was making up for lost time. The creek beside the property ran high and fast with snowmelt, and the sound of it was constant, something Clara came to love the same way she came to love everything particular about this place. Eli had cattle to move and fences to walk after the winter, and Clara worked the house and the kitchen garden and learned from him the rhythms of the ranch. She was not a woman who stood to the side and watched. She rode out with him to check the north fence. She helped him track down 3 calves that had wandered through a winter weekend section, and she showed a competence with horses that surprised him until she reminded him that she had grown up on a farm. "You never told me you could ride like that," he said one evening in April, watching her unsaddle her horse with the efficiency of long practice. "You never asked," she said. He laughed. It was a good laugh, full and real, and she stored it the same way she had stored his smile the first time she had really seen it. She was building a collection of these things, the private inventory of a woman who was paying complete attention. She had a letter from her sister Margaret in Pennsylvania in April, responding to the letter Clara had sent in February announcing the marriage. Margaret's letter was characteristically Margaret, carefully composed, 1 part concern, 1 part congratulation, 2 parts curiosity. She wanted to know everything about Montana and about Eli, and about whether Clara was all right, and the wanting to know was the most affectionate Margaret had ever been in writing, which was considerable. Clara wrote back 8 pages, which was the longest letter she had ever written, and included a description of the valley in spring that took 2 full pages because it deserved them. Eli bought the 40 acres to the north in May. He had been negotiating with the owner, an older rancher named Bertram who was returning to Kansas to be near his children since before the winter, and the deal came through on a Wednesday afternoon that he told Clara about over supper with the same plain tone he used for everything but with a particular brightness in his eyes. "Does that complete what you wanted?" she asked. "It is 300 acres total now," he said. "Yes, I think it does." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Good," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. Summer on a Montana ranch was not a restful season. The days were long and the work was constant, and Clara had learned by July to be useful in ways that she had not known she could be when she arrived in October. She kept the household accounts alongside the ranch accounts, and Eli, who was meticulous about numbers, was grateful for it in his practical way. She organized the root cellar and the larder with the efficiency of someone who had survived a winter in Montana and intended to survive the next one better prepared. She learned to preserve and put up vegetables and fruit in the late summer, and the shelves of the root cellar filled with the satisfying rows of jars that meant security. Rodrigo, who had followed Clara from the Circle H to the Calloway Ranch because, as he told Thomas Hale without any softening, "Mrs. Calloway's cooking is better than Sam Duckett's by a wide margin," played guitar on the porch some evenings after supper. Pete had stayed at the Circle H. Eli had hired a second hand, a tall, quiet young man of 20 named James who had come up from Wyoming looking for work and had proved himself steady and willing. They took on a milk cow in June, Clara's specific project, and the butter she made became something that several women in town requested by name when she came to market. In August, Clara began to suspect what she confirmed in September. She did not say anything for 2 weeks after she was certain, turning it over in her private thoughts, feeling the reality of it settle. Then one evening when they were sitting on the porch in the last of the summer warmth, she told him. Eli turned to look at her. For a moment he was very still, the way he went still when he was receiving important information and letting it land properly. Then something moved across his face that she had never quite seen before, something that was composed of disbelief and joy and gravity all together. The face of a man who has just understood that the world he is living in is larger than the one he inhabited 5 seconds ago. He reached out and took her hand. "Clara," he said. His voice was different. "In the spring," she said. "April, I think." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to it, not the controlled, careful kiss of those early months, but something completely unguarded, and when he lifted his head there were tears in his eyes which she had not expected and which moved her more than almost anything that had happened since she had ridden into this town a year before. "Are you all right?" she asked, smiling. "I am completely all right," he said, which was what she had said to him in the kitchen during the blizzard, and she knew he remembered it because he said it with the same inflection, and she loved him so fiercely in that moment that it was almost physically uncomfortable. The fall of 1883 had a different quality than the fall of the previous year. They knew what was coming now, the kind of winter that Montana delivered, and they prepared for it together with a combined competence that was more than the sum of its parts. The larder was packed. The firewood was stacked in quantities that satisfied even Eli's substantial caution. The fences were checked and reinforced, the cattle were counted, and the weak ones sorted and brought closer to the barn. Clara worked as long as she was able and rested when she needed to, which was a negotiation between her own stubborn energy and the reality of carrying a child. Eli was attentive without being smothering, present without hovering, which was precisely the kind of care she needed, and which she had come to trust him to calibrate correctly. On the first real night of deep cold in November, they lay in the room that had been his and was now theirs, with the fire in the downstairs hearth sending warmth up through the floor, and the wind going about its business outside, and she was aware of the child moving, which had started happening in October with a regularity that still astonished her. "Are you worried about the birth?" Eli asked in the dark. It was the kind of question he asked, the one that got to the real thing without circling. "A little," she said honestly, "not afraid. Worried the way you are worried about something you cannot control." "Dr. Marsh is good," he said. "His son is good too. I have seen him handle difficult situations." "I know," she shifted closer to him. "I'm not asking you to reassure me, I'm just answering your question honestly." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm also a little worried," he said. "I want you to know I said that so that you know you do not have to be worried alone." She reached for his hand under the quilt. "We are not worried alone," she said. "We are worried together, which is a completely different thing." "Yes," he said, "it is." December, and then January, and then February, and the winter felt different from inside this life than it had from inside Thomas Hale's house. It was not easier exactly, but it was inhabited differently, the way a hard thing can be transformed not by becoming easier, but by being shared. Eli brought her books from Harold Finch's small lending collection. He read to her sometimes in the evenings, which was something she had not expected of him, but which he did with a quiet pleasure that suggested he had missed having someone to read with. Nora wrote from Kansas in December, a warm and excitable letter upon hearing the news of the pregnancy, full of advice and questions, and the kind of unsolicited commentary that only sisters can provide without offense. She said she hoped to come and visit in the spring, if the baby had arrived safely by then, and could she bring her husband, and also could she please have the recipe for the preserved apricots that Clara had sent along in the October package because her own attempts were not matching it. Clara wrote back and said yes to all of it, and included the recipe. The baby came on the 8th of April, 1884. Dr. Marsh the younger came out to the ranch on the night of the 7th when it was clear the time had arrived, and by the morning of the 8th the work was done. It was a boy, solid and loud in his announcement of his own existence, with dark hair that came, Eli said, from the Calloway side, and eyes that were impossible to determine yet, but which everyone assumed would turn green. Eli had been outside during the actual birth because the doctor had told him firmly to be outside and useful, so he had gone to the barn and done unnecessary things to equipment for 3 hours, and when Clara heard the footsteps on the porch and then his voice asking the doctor a question, she could hear the effort it was costing him to sound calm. "Come in," she called. He came in and stood in the doorway of their room. She was propped against the pillows with the baby in her arms, and she watched him see his son for the first time, and she would carry that image for the rest of her life. His face went through half a dozen things in the space of 3 seconds, and then settled into something that was not any one emotion but all of them at once. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby up close, and then he looked at Clara and he said, "You are all right." "I am all right," she said. He put his hand on her face the way he had put his hand on her face the first time he kissed her, with that particular careful respect, and she leaned her face into his palm. "What shall we call him?" she asked. He had been thinking about this, she knew, because he had mentioned 2 or 3 names over the winter months with the casual air of a man trying them out without committing. But he looked at the baby for a long moment now and said, "Daniel, if you like it." "Daniel Calloway," she said, trying it. It sat well. "Yes, I like it very much." Daniel grew that spring with the particular velocity of newborns, changing visibly week by week, and the house adjusted around him the way houses adjust around new life, acquiring the small equipment of babyhood and filling with a new layer of noise and presence. Rodrigo, who was not a man known for sentiment, would sometimes sit on the porch with the baby on his knee and play the guitar very softly, and Daniel would look up at him with the absolute attention of someone encountering music for the first time. Nora came in June as she had promised, with her husband Franklin, who was a large, good-natured Kansas farmer with an honest handshake, and the house was full in a way that was loud and happy and only slightly exhausting. Nora was 24, dark-haired like Eli but with a warmth that expressed itself more readily than his did, and she and Clara recognized each other within the first hour as women of the same practical, capable type, and they became friends with the directness that women with limited time for nonsense tend to achieve. Eli watched his sister hold his son one afternoon on the porch, and something in his face went quiet and grateful in the way that it did when he was feeling something he did not have the practice to say out loud. Clara sat beside him and did not say anything either, and after a while he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they watched Nora and Franklin and Daniel in the summer afternoon. "A year ago October," she said after a while. "That was when I came to town." "Less than 2 years ago," he said. "Does that seem right to you?" She looked up at him. "It feels much longer, in the good way." He considered this with his characteristic seriousness. "It feels like the 2 years before you came were much longer," he said. "And these 2 years have been the right speed." She laughed, and he smiled, and Nora looked over at them from the porch steps with the expression of a woman who is genuinely and completely pleased for her brother. The second summer folded into a second fall, and the second fall turned toward the second winter, and one afternoon in late October, when the mountains were going white again, and the valley was that particular gold and amber that precedes the snow, Clara stood on the porch with Daniel on her hip and watched Eli come in from the north fence on horseback, and felt the particular quality of a life that was exactly what it was supposed to be. He dismounted and handed the reins to James and came up to the porch and took Daniel from her, swinging the boy up onto his shoulder with an ease that was still, after all these months, something she loved to watch. Daniel grabbed his hat and put it over his own face, which he had recently discovered was funny. "Good fences?" she asked. "Good fences," he confirmed. "We will not have any cattle wandering this winter." She watched him settle Daniel more comfortably on his shoulder and look out at the mountains the way he did every evening, the assessment of a man who kept close track of what the sky was planning. "Another winter," she said. He looked at her. "Another winter," he agreed, and there was something in how he said it, the ease of it, the settledness that made her think of the winter she had arrived, the desperate and tired and uncertain woman with the broken wheel and the carpetbag, and how she had sat on a bench outside a general store and talked to a practical man who built good fences and rode through blizzards and said things he meant. She had not known then how the arithmetic would work out. She knew now. The following spring, when the mud made the road something between difficult and impassable, and the valley was working itself toward green again, Clara found out she was expecting their second child. She told Eli over coffee on a Tuesday morning with no particular ceremony, and he looked at her across the kitchen table with a warmth that was entirely familiar now and never less welcome for being familiar. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Well," she said. "Good, actually. Better than last time at this point." "Good," he said. He reached across and touched her hand briefly, the small, easy gestures of a marriage that had found its language. Then he said, "I have been thinking about adding on to the house." She raised an eyebrow. "Have you?" "There is room to the east for a proper addition, another room down and another up. If this one needs a room of their own eventually, and Daniel will eventually want a room of their own." She looked at him. "You planned this already." "I considered it," he said carefully. "I wanted to talk to you about it before I planned it." She smiled into her coffee cup. "Talk to me about it," she said. He talked to her about it. The addition would go up in the summer, when the weather allowed for construction. And it did, with Eli and James and a carpenter from town named Ortiz who proved to be both fast and exacting. Clara supervised the kitchen expansion with a specificity that Ortiz respected because she knew what she was talking about, and by September the house was half again the size it had been. The second child was born in December of 1885, a winter birth in a warm house, and this time Eli sat in the kitchen instead of the barn because Clara had told him firmly that she needed him close, not inside the room but close, and he sat at the kitchen table and read the same page of the Dickens book approximately 40 times, and every time Clara made a sound he set down the book, and the doctor would appear briefly in the doorway and say, "Fine. She is fine." Sit down. The baby was a girl. She arrived with her father's dark hair and a pair of lungs that left no one in any doubt about her opinions on the transition from womb to world. Clara held her and said, "Emma," because she had been thinking about the name for months, and it suited what she felt when she looked at the small, fierce face. Eli came in and sat beside her on the bed and held Emma with the practiced steadiness of a man who had been doing this for 18 months with Daniel, and he said, very quietly, looking at his daughter, "Hello." Emma looked up at him. She had just arrived in the world, but she looked at him as if she was considering her verdict. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "Emma Calloway," she said. "She sounds like someone who will have opinions." "She is already having opinions," Eli said, which was the funniest thing he had ever said, delivered with perfect seriousness, and Clara laughed in the exhausted, full-hearted way of a woman who has just done something monumental and is home. Daniel met his sister the next morning, brought in from his room by Rodrigo, and regarded her with the solemn 2-year-old consideration of someone encountering a significant new fact. He pointed at her. He looked at his father. He looked at his mother. He said, "Mine." "Yours," Clara said. "Be gentle." He was, after a fashion. The years that followed had the quality of something built well, not without difficulty, but solid and real and growing. The cattle operation expanded. Eli hired a third hand, a steady older man named Clement who had come up from Colorado and who proved to be invaluable with the horses in particular. Clara's butter and preserves developed a reputation in the county, and she began supplying to Harold Finch's store on a formal arrangement that brought in a modest but consistent income that was entirely her own, which mattered to her in a way she did not need to explain to Eli because he understood it without explanation. Dusty Creek grew. The schoolhouse that had been new when Clara arrived filled with children from the expanding homesteads, and in 1887 Daniel started school, and Clara rode him in on Monday mornings and collected him on Friday afternoons. And she and the teacher, a young woman from Missouri named Harriet Brooks, became friends over many a Friday afternoon collection. Harriet was earnest and capable and completely determined about education, and Clara respected her with the respect she gave anyone who was serious about their work. The town had grown enough by 1887 to have a proper doctor's office, rather than simply relying on Dr. Marsh Jr. making house calls. It had a second general store, a barber shop, and a small newspaper. The newspaper was called the Dusty Creek Courier, and it was edited by a man named Walcott who had opinions about everything and expressed them weekly in print with more confidence than was always warranted. But the paper also reported on the real things, the homestead filings and the school events and the market prices and the weather predictions, and those real things mattered. The newspaper also reported in the fall of 1887 on the ongoing conflicts further south between settlers and the remnants of indigenous communities who had been pushed from their lands over the decades, a reporting that Walcott handled more fairly than many papers of his type. Clara read those accounts with a heaviness that she and Eli discussed at the kitchen table, because the injustice of what had been done to the people who had been here before any of them was not something either of them was comfortable dismissing. Eli had known Apache families when he was a boy in Texas, had been treated with kindness by people who had every reason to treat newcomers with suspicion, and he held no romanticized or dismissive view of the matter. The land they worked had been other people's land, and the history of how it changed hands was not clean, and they both knew it. These were not comfortable conversations, but they were honest ones, and Clara thought that honest discomfort was better than comfortable ignorance. Their third child arrived in the spring of 1888, another boy, who they named Thomas after the man who had paid a debt in good faith and given Clara work in that first winter, and who remained a friend and occasional Sunday dinner guest at the Calloway ranch. Thomas Hale stood godfather for the baby at the christening with a pride in his big handshake way that made his wife, who had returned from Denver the previous year, quietly pleased for him. By the summer of 1888, Clara Calloway stood in the yard of her house, the house that had been built for more than one person by a man who had not known why at the time, and watched Daniel, who was 4, explaining something to Emma, who was 2.5, with the earnest authority of a big brother who has decided his sister needs an education immediately. Baby Thomas was asleep inside, watched over by Nora, who had come for another visit with Franklin and their own 2 children, and the sound of the children and the guitar from the porch and the cattle in the far meadow and the creek and the wind through the summer grass was the sound of a life that was full. Eli came from the barn and stood beside her. He had spent the morning doctoring a calf that had taken a bad step on rocky ground, and he had the look of satisfied work around him. He looked at the yard where Daniel was now demonstrating something to Emma that involved picking up a stick, and he looked at the mountains above the valley, and he looked at Clara. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She thought about October of 1882, about riding into this town with nothing she needed and everything she was. She thought about a bench outside a general store and a man who offered to walk her to the yellow house because he was going that direction anyway. She thought about Thursdays, all the Thursdays, and a porch in December with stars overhead, and a blizzard in February, and a winter light in a main room and a voice saying, "I would like you to marry me." She thought about "stay one more winter," which he had said to her in February of 1883 when she had, during one of those kitchen evenings, mentioned that she might look at the situation again in spring, evaluate her options, which had been a thing she said less because she meant it and more because saying it made her feel less like a woman who had simply stopped being careful in the way she used to have to be careful. He had looked up from his coffee and said it very quietly, "Stay one more winter," with a simplicity that was not an order and not entirely a request but something in between, the kind of thing a person says when they are leaving the door open rather than closing it, trusting the other person to choose. She had chosen. She looked at him now in the summer sun, this man who had said it, and thought that choosing had been the most accurate thing she had ever done. Not reckless, not desperate, not settled for. Accurate. As if she had calculated the right answer from available evidence, and the answer had turned out to be him and this land and this life, and the sound of Daniel explaining sticks to Emma in the summer yard. "I am thinking," she said, "about winter." He raised an eyebrow slightly, the particular questioning look she had catalogued over years. "It is June," he said. "I know. I think about the winters here sometimes." She looked at the mountains, the first one especially. He was quiet for a moment, looking where she was looking. "Are you sorry you stayed?" She turned to look at him with a directness that left nothing to interpretation. "Are you seriously asking me that?" Something in his face relaxed into that smile, the real one, the one she had been collecting since January of 1883. "No," he said, "I am not seriously asking you that." She took his hand. "The answer would be no anyway," she said, "in case you ever have a moment of wondering." "I do not wonder," he said. "I know." She leaned into him, as she had learned over these years to do without thinking, and he put his arm around her with the ease of 5 years of practice. Daniel, across the yard, had abandoned the stick lesson in favor of climbing on the fence, and Emma had promptly picked up the stick herself and was doing something with it that had nothing to do with whatever Daniel had been explaining. "He is going to be an impressive cowboy someday," Eli said, watching his son on the fence. "He is going to fall off that fence in about 3 seconds," Clara said. He did. He was completely fine, bouncing up from the grass with the resilience of 4-year-olds and immediately assessing whether Emma had seen. Emma had seen, and she was laughing. Eli called out to Daniel that fences were for looking at and leaning on, not for climbing, and Daniel nodded seriously and then looked immediately for another fence. And Clara put her head against Eli's shoulder and let herself laugh. The full, unguarded laugh that had first surprised her on a bench outside a general store in a town she had never heard of, and which now came as easily and as often as breathing. The summer went its way and the fall came again, the valley cycling through its amber and gold toward the white that would follow, and one evening in late October, with the first serious chill in the air and the mountains already showing their first dusting of new snow at the peaks, Eli built a fire in the main room fireplace for the first season, and Clara put Daniel and Emma to bed, and the house settled into the particular quiet of evening. She sat beside him on the settle in front of the fire with Thomas, now 6 months old, and practicing the art of staying awake despite all evidence that he was exhausted, propped between them. Eli had a cup of coffee and she had a cup of tea, and the fire was doing what fires do in stone fireplaces in October in Montana. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" she said. "Tell me," he said, as he always said, with the readiness of a man who always meant it. "I was thinking about what October used to feel like, before." She did not say before what, he knew. "It used to feel like a season I had to survive, cold and difficulty and uncertainty, something to get through." She looked at the fire. "Now it just feels like October." He considered this. "Good October or neutral October?" "Good October," she said. "Definitively good October. The beginning of something I know how to inhabit." He reached over and put his hand on hers, Thomas grasping at his father's fingers with the unfocused determination of very small children. "I like that," he said. "Knowing how to inhabit something. You were the one who taught me that," she said. "You inhabit this land and this life and this place as if you built them all from scratch, which you essentially did, and being around someone who does that teaches you how it is done." He looked at her. "You taught yourself most of it," he said, with characteristic accuracy. "I taught myself the skills," she said. "You taught me the philosophy." He seemed to think about whether to accept this, and then nodded once in the way he did when he was accepting something as accurate. Thomas had finally given up the battle against sleep and gone boneless between them, and Eli picked him up carefully and held him against his shoulder, and the baby slept in the firelight without any further argument. "Another winter coming," Clara said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him across the sleeping baby, in the firelight, in the house he had built, in the life they had made, with the mountains outside and the snow coming and the children asleep and the ranch settled for the season and the accounts balanced and the fences good and the larder full. And she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "Another winter," she said, "and I could not be more glad of it." He looked at her with that particular warmth, the warmth that was entirely specific to her and that she had been the recipient of for years now, and that she would, she was perfectly certain, be the recipient of for all the years to come. "Neither could I," he said. Thomas made a sound in his sleep, and Daniel called out from upstairs about something that turned out to be nothing, and Emma made a brief appearance at the top of the stairs before being redirected to bed by the sound of her father's voice saying her name once, firmly and lovingly, and the fire burned, and the wind moved over the valley, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, white and enormous and perfectly indifferent to the small human happiness happening at their feet. Clara Calloway, who had arrived in Dusty Creek, Montana in October of 1882 with a broken wheel and a carpetbag, and a name that meant nothing to anyone, leaned back against the settle and looked at her life and found it to be the right size, the right shape, the right everything, hard sometimes and always honest, and inhabited with a completeness that she had not known was possible until it was actual. Outside, the first snow of the new season began to fall, light and certain, settling on the porch railing and the barn roof and the fence line and the meadow where the cattle stood patient and knowing in the dark. The mountains disappeared into white. The creek ran on beneath its first skin of ice. The night came down and the cold came with it, the deep, absolute cold of a Montana winter that was not something to fear but something to know, to prepare for, to live inside with competence and warmth and the company of people you chose. She had been asked to stay one more winter, and she had stayed, And then winter had become spring, and spring had become summer, and summer had become fall, and fall had become another winter. And in this way years had passed, and children had been born, and fences had been built and mended, and a house had been added onto, and a ranch had grown, and a woman who had arrived unsure of everything had become certain of the things that mattered most. She had never left after that. She had never wanted to. And outside the snow fell, and the fire burned, and the baby slept, and the mountains stood in Dusty Creek. Montana held them all in the way. A good place holds the people who have chosen it, completely and without condition. And the winter came on and was welcome, as all winters are welcome when you have something warm and true to come home to.